Hello everybody, glad you could come and join me again today for another story. And today's story is about the gnome who sold sawdust. So let's begin. There was once a little gnome who lived in a tiny house on Tinker's Common. A house with a chimney, slippery slope at each side of it, for all the world like a pair of horns or ears. This gnome was a busy little fellow, but always willing to do a neighbourly turn for another. He was fond of saying, "I like to be a neighbour when I can." Indeed, he did so many good turns for this person and for that the folk began to call him neighbour, and after a time that was the name by which he was known. Neighbour's little house was in a shady spot, not far from the wild awake tree. His nearest neighbour was the giant snail, who was always pleasant and kind, if a trifle absent-minded. One day, when the giant snail was travelling across the common in a wandery way, trying to remember what it was he required, he had the bad fortune to meet Big Grumble, the giant who lived near the common and was always grunting and grumbling. The moment the big Grumble caught sight of the giant snail, he flew into ever such a passion. "Ha!" cried he, "now I have got you, and I shall beat you to a jelly with my stick. You are the wretch who has been eating my cabbages, so that I cannot have cabbage pie." The giant snail was full of surprise and grief. "Indeed, Mr. Big Grumble," cried he, "I have not touched your cabbages. I was gently brought up and never eat anything coarser than spinach, and that only when it is young and tender. You are the only snail giant enough to eat my cabbages," roared Big Grumble, "so it must have been you who ate them." And he rushed at Giant Snail and began to beat him with his stick. Now, it was quite certain that Giant Snail would have been beaten to a jelly if the giant had not at that moment heard the cranberry man calling cranberries, and dashed off to secure his load. The giant snail lay by a bush for a long time, feeling very ill, his beautiful house all crushed and broken. He thought, "A homeless snail I am. I feel I'd rather like to die. I have no bench, I have no bin, and not a soul will take me in." But at that moment, across the commons came Neighbour, bearing on his back a bundle of fresh young twigs, which he thought would look nice and smell nice around the floor of his little house. When Neighbour saw the plight of Giant Snail, he was greatly grieved, and he set down his bundle and sat down and said, "Pray, Neighbour, tell me the tale of your woes." And the giant snail, when he had shed a few bright tears, told Neighbour the gnome the sad adventure that had befallen him. "And I had better die," said he. "Come now, don't be so discouraged," said Neighbour. "Let me tell you, things are never so bad that they might not be worse. Pray come home with me now, and I will lend you my little house till your wounds are mended and you feel well again, for I always like to be a neighbour if I can." So the giant snail plucked up the courage and journeyed with the gnome neighbour to Neighbour's little house. And very nice that little house looked with its two slanty horns. Neighbor had to take down the door and a little bit of wall so that the giant snail could get inside. But when he was inside, oh, how well that little house fitted him! It looked exactly like a giant shell. Ah, now we are both of us happy, cried Neighbor, for I shall spread my bundle of twigs beneath the branches of the wide-awake tree and be as happy as a king. As for you, Giant Snail, when you are quite recovered, I should advise you to travel to some other spot, lest again you encounter Big Grumble, for the giant is a great fellow for bearing a grudge. That I will, said Giant Snail, and when he thanked Neighbor again and again, he fell asleep. Now, day by day, the Giant Snail mended and became stronger and stronger, and day by day, Neighbor the Gnome lived as best he could, and at night he slept by the wide-awake tree. Then one morning, the Giant Snail waked up quite recovered, and at once he remembered what Neighbor had said to him about living elsewhere, where he would not be likely to meet Big Grumble the giant. Ha! I will set out at once, thought he. And because he was in the habit of carrying his house on his back, and because he was an absent-minded creature, he forgot all about Neighbor's little house with its two slanty ears, and away he went on his journey across the common, bearing that little house with him, and soon reached the other side and distant places from which he never returned. Now Neighbor woke up a little late, and when he looked at the spot where his house should have been, his eyes almost popped out of his head. He looked each side, and he looked behind. Then he looked again at the spot where his house should have been. Alas, it was plain as plain that there was no house there. Ah, this must be a horrid dream, cried Neighbor the Gnome. But the wide-awake tree replied, You've been a neighbor, little gnome, and thus you've lost your little home. The giant snail has gone away, his memory too has gone astray. I fear he has forgotten quite who helped him in his horrid plight. At first Neighbor the gnome was in an angry way, and he cried, This is what comes of being a neighbor. But after a time he remembered that the giant snail had really been very grateful and was at all times an absent-minded creature. And he said to himself, Well, never mind, things might have been worse. At any rate, the giant snail has got away from the giant. So he roamed about the common, trying to find some way of earning an honest penny or two towards setting up another little house. Alas, there was nothing doing on Tinker's Common, for no one seemed to have any pence. Then Neighbor the Gnome went further, and he came upon at last the house of Big Grumble the giant, and there was a big commotion. For at the back of the giant's big house, workmen were busy sawing and planing, and running from one spot to another. For the giant was having quite a large new piece put on to the back of his house, and a great deal of wood was being used. Now there was sawdust everywhere, and one of the workmen cried, What would I not give to anyone who would take this sawdust away? When Neighbor the Gnome heard this, he was full of joy and at once presented himself. What will you pay me if I take it away? Asked he, for I always like to be a neighbor if I can. The workman laughed at the sight of the gnome, but he said, If you will work quickly and steadily, without grumbling, I will pay you 6 pence an hour." "That will suit me very well," said neighbour. So he borrowed a barrow and a long shovel and a broom and set to work to clear the sawdust away. He did not take it very far, only as far as Silent Tree, which Big Grumble the giant never passes, if he can help it. There neighbour heaped the sawdust. "I will take it further presently," thought he. Neighbour worked till dusk at removing the sawdust, and when the workmen had finished their day's toil and were going, neighbour had finished his task too. He was given 5 silver sixpence, for he had worked for 5 hours, and all the sawdust was gone. And now there was a great commotion at the front of Giant's house, a roaring and ranting, and grunting and grumbling. So neighbour crept close to see what it was about. It was plain that Big Grumble was in a dreadful temper about something, and was making trouble for everybody. And presently out of the front door tumbled a servant, carrying a meal bag and crying, "But it is of no use going to the mealman's shop, for the mealman has gone home." And behind him came the giant's voice roaring, "If you cannot find meal for my porridge, why, off goes your head." Then neighbour slid close to the servant, and as the man scrambled to his feet, the little gnome whispered, "What will you give me if I fill your bag with meal? For I like to be a neighbour if I can." The man replied, "A golden button as large as a sixpenny piece." "That will do very well," said neighbour the gnome. "Give me the meal bag and go, and on no account must you follow me." Neighbour soon hastened with the meal bag to the spot where the sawdust was, and working as hard as he could, he soon filled the meal bag. But it was too heavy for him to carry, and he had to hasten away to the carrier's to borrow his nag. Neighbour had done many neighbourly acts for the carrier, and he lent him the nag willingly. And not so long after, neighbour was at the giant's door, delivering the full bag. The giant's servant seized it eagerly and paid neighbour a golden button. "We have many other empty bags," said he. "If you will fill them all with meal, as good as this seems to be, you shall have a golden button for each." "That will I," said the neighbour eagerly. And he added, I like to be a neighbour if I can." So he took away the empty sacks and filled them one and all with sawdust, and slinging one at each side of the carrier's nag, he bore them to the giant's door. This took the little gnome the greater part of the night, and since Big Grumble was fast asleep after his porridge, neighbour had little to fear. At last the last sack was delivered. The sawdust had been taken, every grain, and neighbour left the giant's door with as many gold buttons as would pay for a little house and one to spare. Neighbour gave the carrier a gold button for the use of his nag, and cooked the carrier's breakfast for him beside. Then he flew away to sleep under the wide awake tree, for very, very weary was he. And then Wide Awake Tree sang softly to herself, "He'll build a house as nice, and though he'll be a neighbour too, I think he'll hardly lend one twice. That's a thing one doesn't do." As for Big Grumble the giant, he didn't know his porridge was made of sawdust, and if he grumbled a bit about his porridge, why, he would have grumbled anyway. So that's the story of the neighbor, the gnome, and Big Grumble. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember, if you like my stories, don't forget to press the like button, share these stories, and hit the subscribe button too. So see you again tomorrow with a new story. Have a great day. Bye bye.